If you're out and about one day and you hear some kind of strange buzzing coming from the skies and you can't quite work out what it is, you might look up in the sky to find something that looks a little bit like a bird or a plane, but isn't a bird or a plane. In fact, it's one of these things. These drones are now so small that they literally come under 250 grams and for many have lots of privacy issues. And this is what we're talking about in this video today. So welcome back, I'm the Black Belt Barrister, talking about drones today and the potential privacy issues that have come into play. I'm going to give you a broad overview and I'm going to sort of argue both sides so as to remain unbiased, despite the fact that I have one of these drones, and I'm going to tell you some of my sort of best tips that I would use if I'm using one of these to fly around with and take footage, and give you an overview of what the law is and how the law would address such privacy issues with regard to drones flying around in public. Just as a caveat, this should not be taken as legal advice and you cannot rely upon it as legal advice because all of your situations might be very subtly different, even if broadly they seem to be the same. However, with that said, the reason I'm talking about this is because I've seen a number of different videos lately with what I would call bad advice or misguided interpretation of the law by relevant officers. Notably in a recent video by a police community support officer telling the person that if they fly a drone outside, they must be prepared to delete the footage if somebody asks them to, and they must show that footage to anybody that asks to see it. And that's not quite right. Now, many people think the Data Protection Act doesn't apply to individuals at all. And that's not quite right either. Understandably, most people think that it does mainly apply to businesses, which is true. It does mainly apply to businesses. So the Data Protection Act and the retained GDPR, i.e. GDPR post-Brexit, that the UK still incorporates into law, predominantly applies to businesses, but with the margins and the boundaries for journalism and artistic creation between individuals as against organizations coming so much closer together, it's relevant to address both. So starting out with businesses, of course businesses need to comply with the Data Protection Act if they are data controllers for the purposes of the Act. All that means is that they gather or they process some personal data in respect of an individual, which makes them identifiable. Now that could be whether they know who they are or not. If any of that information, taken together with other information, can identify who that person is, then they are a data controller for the purposes of the Act and they must comply with the Data Protection Act. However, how can that then apply to individuals? Well, there are exemptions for individuals if it's a wholly household activity. For example, if you are filming inside of your house and you're not going to share it with anybody else, then of course the Data Protection Act is not going to apply. However, court cases have decided with regard to doorbell cameras, for example, if the camera films anything beyond the curtilage of your premises, then court cases have held that this is not a wholly household activity because it is surveilling somebody outside of the curtilage of your premises and thus engaging the Data Protection Act in a very limited format. Moving on to drones, somebody flying a drone, of course, is going to be filming somebody outside of their household and potentially sharing it online or sharing it with friends. Now this would depend on whether they are sharing it on their Facebook group with a select group of friends, for example, or if it's going on YouTube with an indefinite number of people watching it. In that situation, it is unlikely to be a wholly household activity because, as I said, there's an indefinite number of people on YouTube that could potentially watch that video. So ordinarily, that would engage the Data Protection Act, even if the person is an individual and not an organization. However, it's not quite as simple as that. Some people have interpreted that to mean that the Data Protection Act applies, then you must show it, you must delete it on request, and so on and so forth. However, there are certain exemptions. Now this is where you must seek formal legal advice depending on your situation because it might change very slightly depending on how you are filming and using the material. For example, you could have something which is constantly trained on a given area. It could be just random recreational footage that you're not profiting from, and you're just publicizing it for interest and artistic purposes and so on. However, the lines are a little bit more frayed when it comes to publishing them on YouTube, and obviously your YouTube channel is likely to be monetized, and so you are earning money from the channel. That certainly takes it outside of a household activity, but that's not the end of the story either. You see, the exemptions to data protection also include a journalistic and an artistic exemption. So whilst it is for you to demonstrate that you are within one of these exemptions, i.e. journalism or artistic creation, then this exemption would bring you back outside of the requirements of the Data Protection Act, provided you can show a number of things, which I'll come back to in just a moment. So what is journalism? Well, this is less and less clear as time goes on, because we have what is affectionately referred to as citizen journalists. And in my view, the law shouldn't really distinguish between a citizen journalist and a news corporation. Why? Well, why should a news corporation be granted special treatment as against an individual with a camera who wants to go out and film the same things? As I have frequently referred, somebody commented against Charlie Veitch saying, "I don't like Charlie Veitch because he walks around filming things whilst talking about them." Which is, of course, exactly what news companies are doing. They are taking a camera, filming something and talking about it. Just like some people have criticized law tubers or legal commentators for commenting on certain trials. All the media companies are doing exactly the same thing. So how can it be, or why should it be, that an individual commenting on certain things should be criticized when the news companies are doing precisely the same thing? That is why, obviously, these boundaries are not just frayed in my view, but in my view, obliterated. Because if an individual takes a camera and is filming something, that's no different than a news company doing it, provided that it's a certain type of journalism. Provided that the journalism stays within the bounds of this balance between the right to privacy and the freedom of expression and journalism and artistic creation. And that, I suggest, is the real heart of the issue in these cases. So starting with the assumption that people do not have an absolute right to privacy in a public place, if someone is filming them, there still needs to be an exemption. That could either be the wholly household activity, in which case it's not published online, it's only shared privately, and so on and so forth, or it comes within one of the legal exemptions such as journalism or artistic creation. Very arguably, there is artistic creation in flying a drone around to get artistic footage of a given area, even if that's a building or a business or a police station and so on. However, there needs to be consideration as to whether the individuals within that footage are identifiable. If they are not identifiable, then this doesn't really cause a problem. If they are identifiable, then consideration needs to be given as to whether the privacy aspect is outweighed by the artistic or journalistic nature of the video in question. For example, if someone were to fly one of these drones right outside somebody's window and they are hovering, looking inside somebody's window, clearly that is invasion of privacy, which is not going to be outweighed by the journalistic or the artistic nature of the video by watching somebody through their bedroom window. However, taking a much more normal scenario where somebody is just flying around above head and looking at the general area, capturing some beautiful landscape of the city, perhaps at sunset or even during the day or whatever it might be. If this is normal footage captured for artistic or journalistic purposes, then whilst it would be for the individual to argue that this falls within that exemption if ever a claim were brought, which I'll come back to in a moment, then this would very likely fall within one of these exemptions, and therefore the requirements under the Data Protection Act by and large will fall away. Now, I said I would come back to bringing of a claim. Now, if an individual is captured on camera, then a business is not going to be able to bring a claim for breach of data protection because it's not an individual, it's a business. Security aspects might be a different issue, but that's going to be an entirely different claim and probably somewhat difficult to prove. The individual, however, would probably be able to bring a claim and have it heard in court. So anybody out filming with the drone is not just automatically exempt from a court claim because they rely on journalistic or artistic license in order to publish this video. However, it would serve as a defense if they do choose to rely on it and can prove to the court's satisfaction that it's journalistic, it's artistic, or it's purely household. In other words, it's not going up on YouTube for monetary gain. Which in the case of most publishers online, it's likely to be on YouTube and it's likely to be for monetary gain. Let's be honest, guys, you're putting these videos online often to attract an audience by provoking a response, which many people disagree with. Some people think it's entertaining. Some people think it's keeping the police or police community support officers or security guards in check. In other words, keeping them in line with what they are legally permitted to do as against their misunderstandings or potential misunderstandings of the law. So with all that said and done, what would I do if I'm out filming with a drone? Well, first of all, I'm going to have consideration as to where I am filming, not least of which because the drone regulations prevent you from flying over a crowd of people in all circumstances, but also the nature of the area, the nature of whether or not there's likely to be a rise to a complaint of privacy in that area. And for example, if you're flying it low into somebody's garden, looking into somebody's windows, clearly this is something I'm not going to be doing. If I am flying a drone, what I'm likely to do is take the drone up to a sufficient height directly so that individuals are not likely to be identifiable. And I'm not going to zoom in on a given area so that the same reason individuals are not likely to be identifiable, thus the Data Protection Act is not going to be engaged anyway. I say that I would take the drone up immediately so that if there is any what we call incidental inclusion of individuals in the meantime, that is much less likely to cause a problem because it would be, as the saying suggests, incidental inclusion, which is unavoidable. But otherwise, if I want to get aerial footage of a city, of an area and that kind of thing, then the journalistic and the artistic exemption is likely to apply because I'm taking aerial footage of a city, which is going to be attractive for somebody to look at and to enjoy watching on my YouTube channel. So as I said at the outset of this video, don't rely on this as a complete explanation of the law, or certainly not legal advice. If you are in a difficult position, you must take formal legal advice depending on your precise circumstances, because they do differ. We have been instructed on various different cases which vary widely, even though you might think it's just a drone with a camera or a man with a camera. We are instructed on cases that vary a great deal, and the law can apply in different ways in different scenarios. The courts have shown that this to be the case. For example, with the doorbell cameras that capture footage outside of the curtilage of a property. It does engage the Data Protection Act in a very limited fashion, in that individuals that are caught walking by could request their data in that narrow circumstance, or neighbors could complain that their area, their garden, for example, is captured, particularly if audio is captured, because then if they're in their garden having what they think is a private conversation, but your camera is recording the entire thing, that would amount to surveillance, and that would engage the Data Protection Act. However, as to the argument that a drone is surveillance of an area just because it's flying overhead, I don't accept that argument in its entirety, because the drone is likely to be so far overhead, it's not recording audio in most circumstances, and therefore not likely to engage the Data Protection Act in the way that some of these officers have said so. And as to the argument that someone else can demand to see the footage or demand that it's deleted, that's not entirely accurate either. They can only do that if the Data Protection Act is engaged, if there is a relevant complaint, if that is upheld, if it's valid, and as I said, none of these exemptions apply, which in probably most of these cases, it's likely to apply, particularly if it's not a fixed camera, it's not in a fixed location, you are flying it around, and there's artistic creation in the footage, or it's purely for journalistic purposes. So I hope that is some clarification for those that are worried about this. As I say, I reiterate, this cannot be taken as legal advice. You must seek for more legal advice. But nonetheless, I hope it helps. Please like the video and subscribe. I've done a few other videos on this subject. You can check those out in my video library of probably well over 1,000 videos by now. Please also check out Black Belt Secrets in the description below. There's lots of videos on there you might enjoy. And as always, thank you for watching.